Ezra Calloway never missed a man he set out after, and in 11 years of riding at his shoulder, I never once saw him bring in the wrong one. So when the two of us took the warrant on the Mercer woman that cold spring, I figured it for another easy bounty and a soft bed in cold water by the dark of the month. I was wrong about near everything that came after, and I've had 30 years to be glad of it. It started in the Coldwater Land Office, with Royce Temple's voice filling the place up like smoke. T-Fee Man owned most of the grass between the Burnt Fork and the Salt Lick Hills, and he carried himself like he owned the air over it too. He had a strongbox gone, he said, near $2,000 in notes and coin, and a hired woman who'd run off with the whole of it in the night. He wanted her brought back. He wanted her tried. The way he said tried, with his jaw set and his eyes flat, a man could hear the rope in it. "Della Mercer," he said, and laid the warrant on the counter like he was dealing a card he'd been holding all night. "Cooked in my house near a year. Cold as a creek in January, that one. Smiled at my wife and robbed me blind. You'll know her by the trouble she leaves." Ezra read the paper twice the way he always did, slow, his thumb moving down it. He had a face the weather had finished a long time ago, brown and seamed, and you couldn't tell from it whether he believed a word. That was worth money, that face. Men confessed to it just to fill the quiet. "Description's thin," Ezra said. "Says dangerous, says armed. Don't say how a cook came to be either." "She's clever," Tempel said. "Clever's the danger. She'll talk a saint out of his boots." He set down a roll of notes that would have bought a good horse and a better saddle. "Half now. Half when she's standing in front of the judge. I don't care to hear the road you take to get her there." I watched Ezra's eyes go to that money and then go past it, out the window, to the gray street and the gray sky. I'd seen him turn down warrants over less. He had a rule he never said out loud but rode by all the same. He'd hunt a man who'd earned the hunting, and he'd leave the rest for somebody hungrier. I'd asked him once how he sorted the two, and he'd said a guilty man runs different than a scared one, and you can read it in the ground if you've buried enough of your own life to know the difference. "We'll bring her in," Ezra said. "To the judge, not to you." Tempel's smile slipped, then caught itself. "She comes back to my range to answer for what she took." "She comes to the territorial court," Ezra said. "That's where a warrant ends. You want her, you can stand up in the same room and say your piece." For just a breath Tempel looked at him, the way a man looks at a fence he means to cut later, when nobody's by. Then he laughed and clapped Ezra on the shoulder and called it fair, and we were hired. Out on the boardwalk I lit my pipe and said, 2,000 and a dangerous woman. We've taken worse for less." "We have," Ezra said. He was looking at the warrant still. "Tell me what's wrong with it." I'd ridden with him long enough to know it wasn't a riddle, it was schooling. "Money's too much for a cook to steal in a strongbox a cook couldn't lift," I said. "And a man that rich don't send for two like us over a thief he could hang himself. He'd post a reward and let the country bring her in piecemeal. He paid for quiet." "He paid for quiet," Ezra agreed, and folded the paper away, and that was the last easy thing about the whole business. We cut her trail 4 days north, where the Burnt Fork bends through the breaks. She'd been smart about it, smarter than the warrant let on. She'd ridden water where she could and rock where she had to, and she'd doubled once just to cost us a day, and a green tracker would have lost her at the first ford. But Ezra wasn't green, and the country up there wears its secrets thin. By the second week we knew her stride and her habits like we knew our own. She made cold camps. She favored her right hand. She set her fires small and downwind and kicked them dead before light. She wasn't running scared, exactly. She was running careful. There's a difference, and Ezra noticed it before I did. "Scared runs in a line," he said one evening, hunkered over the cold ash of her last camp, turning a burnt match in his fingers. "Wants distance, nothing else. This one's thinking. She rests her horse. She doctors a stone bruise instead of riding it lame." He stood and looked north into the dusk. "She means to live a long time. Thief headed for a sea coast don't ration like that." "What's she headed for then?" He didn't answer. He'd taken to not answering, which with Ezra meant he was chewing something he didn't like the taste of. We caught her at a place called Dove Tank, a sink of green water ringed in cottonwoods where the breaks open onto the flats. Ezra read it before we rode down, her horse picketed easy, a fire she hadn't bothered to hide, washing spread on a limb to dry. A camp a person makes when they think they've got a day's lead and mean to use it for rest. We came in slow with the sun behind us, and I'll say this plain so you understand the kind of woman she was from the first. She heard us at 100 yards, and she didn't bolt and she didn't beg. She walked out from the cottonwoods with a rifle hanging easy in her right hand, pointed at nothing, and she stood in the open where we could see her and waited for us to declare ourselves. I have seen hard men take cover at the sight of two riders. She stood in the open. "That's far enough," she called, her voice carried level. "You're Tempels or you're not. Say which and I'll know how this goes." Ezra reined up easy, both hands where she could see them. "We're not Tempels," he said. "We carry a warrant with your name on it, Della Mercer." "That's Tempels," she said. "Same thing, wearing better boots." I'd built a whole picture of her on the trail, the way you do, off the warrant in Tempel's voice, cold as a creek in January. I'd pictured a sharp, narrow, grasping kind of woman, the kind that takes a strongbox and never looks back. What stood at Dove Tank was sun-browned and trail-thin, with a man's hat pushed back off a face that had decided a long time ago not to be afraid where it could help it. There was nothing cold in it. There was a banked, careful anger, and under that something steadier, something that had been holding a load a long while and meant to keep holding it. She looked at Ezra the way you'd look at weather coming, gauging how bad and how soon. "I didn't take his money," she said. "I'll say it once since you've come a long way to hear different. I worked his house 11 months. I cooked and I kept his books when his eyes got too bad to do it, and I found a thing in those books a man like Tempel will hang a woman to keep buried. I didn't run with $2,000. I ran with the truth of what he is, and that's worth more than the strongbox to him, which is why he wants me dead and not in any court that keeps a record." There it was, the whole of it, laid out flat in the cottonwood shade before we'd so much as got down off our horses. I expected Ezra to give her the line he gave them all. That wasn't his to judge, the court would sort it. She could tell the judge what she'd told him. He'd said it 100 times to 100 liars. He didn't say it now. He sat his horse and looked at her a long moment, and I watched him do the thing I'd watched him do 100 times, reading the ground of a person, and I watched him not like what he read. "You favor your right hand," he said at last. "You've doctored your horse twice that I saw. You ration like you mean to live. You set your camp tonight like a person resting, not a person hunted." He paused. "Where were you headed, Miss Mercer?" The question seemed to catch her off her guard worse than the rifle would have. "Hadley's Crossing," she said. "The territorial seat. There's a court there a man can't buy whole. I've got something to put in front of a judge who isn't Royce Tempel's man." Her chin came up. "I'm not running from the law, I'm running to it. You've got it backwards, the both of you. I have hauled in more than my share of folks who swore to heaven they were innocent. And I'll tell you there's a music to the lie and a different music to the truth, and an old hand learns to hear it. I heard the true note in her then. I think Ezra heard it before she finished her first sentence. But a warrant's a warrant, and we'd taken Tempel's money, and a man like Ezra didn't unmake a thing he'd given his word to over a feeling in the cottonwoods. "You'll come with us," he said. "But we're not riding to Tempel. We're riding to the same court you were headed for, Hadley's Crossing. You'll stand in front of the judge and you'll say all this and you'll show him whatever it is you're carrying. And if it's a lie, the rope'll have you. And if it's true," he stopped. "If it's true, then I've been pointed wrong and I'll set it right." She studied him for the longest time. Then she set the rifle butt down in the dirt, an inch of trust offered, no more. "I'll come to that court on my own horse," she said, "or you'll carry a dead woman because I won't be tied across a saddle for Tempel's riders to find. That's my terms. You take them or you earn your 2,000 the hard way." Ezra looked at me. I shrugged, which was as much vote as he ever needed from me. "Her horse," he said. "Her rifle stays in my scabbard till I know you better, Miss Mercer. That's mine." "Fair," she said. And that was the bargain, struck over green water with the sun going down red behind the breaks, and not a one of us guessing what we just agreed to ride into. We made camp together that night, the three of us, which was its own strange thing. A bounty's a quiet, ugly business as a rule. You take a person, and you keep a fence of silence up between you and them, because it goes easier handing over a stranger than a soul you've talked to. Ezra knew that better than any man alive. And yet that first night he set her to the fire and gave her the coffee first, and when she asked could she keep her own knife to eat with, he looked at me and then said yes, and I knew the fence was already down whether he meant it or not. She told us pieces of it over the days that followed, never all at once, the way a person tells a thing that costs them. She'd come west widowed and broke, she said, and taken the cook's place at Tempel's because it was honest work and a roof. Tempel had a son, Lyle, a soft, mean young man who decided early that anything under his father's roof was his to take, and that had included her in his thinking. She'd put a skillet across his face the night he tried it, and she'd told the old man straight, expecting justice. The old man had looked at her a long while, she said, and then he'd asked her how the books were coming. Because she kept his books by then. His eyes had gone, and his pride wouldn't let him hire it out to a man in town who'd talk, so the cook who could cipher kept the ledgers, and the cook who could cipher had seen what was in them. Tempel had been selling beef he didn't own. Half the territory's strays and a good few neighbors' branded stock had gone east under his road brand, and the books carried two sets of numbers, the true and the shown, and Della Mercer had copied the true ones onto pages of her own before she understood what she was holding. When she put the skillet across Lyle's face, and the old man asked about the books instead of the boy, she understood. The next morning the strongbox was reported stolen, and her name was on it, and a rider had been sent quiet to fetch men like us. "I took my own wages," she said the third night, low, watching the fire. $40 owed and earned, and I took the true pages because they're the only thing in this world that keeps me from being a story Tempel tells however he likes. Everything else he can swear to. He can't swear away his own hand in his own book. "Where are they?" Ezra asked. She looked at him. "Somewhere a dead woman's word can still reach," she said, and would say no more, and he didn't press her, and I marked that too, that he let her keep one card, when keeping nothing was the whole art of our trade. "I want to tell you about the snakebite, because it's where the fence came all the way down and didn't go back up. It was me that got bit, fool that I am, reaching for kindling in the dark like a man who's forgotten what country he's in. A rattler caught me on the back of the hand, and I knew before I'd finished swearing that it was a bad one. By midnight I was out of my head, my arm swelled up black to the elbow, and I have no memory of 2 days of it except in pieces. The pieces I have are this: Della Mercer's hands. She doctored snakebite before, on the trail and in the cattle camps, and she went at me with a sureness that cut clean through Ezra's worry. She cut and drew and packed the wound with something she boiled out of a root she sent Ezra to dig. She sat up with me both nights. When the fever had me talking to dead men, she talked back to them in my place, gentle, so I'd quiet. And on the second morning when it broke and I came up out of it weak as a calf, the first thing I saw was the two of them, her asleep sitting up against a cottonwood with her hand still on my wrist counting the blood in me, and Ezra across the fire watching her sleep with a look on his face I had not seen there since before his Sarah died. I closed my eyes again and let them think I slept, because some things a man shouldn't be caught watching. But I'd seen it. The stone had cracked. Whatever Ezra Calloway had buried with his wife and the child that went with her, this thin, proud woman with my blood on her hands had reached down into the grave of it and laid her palm flat on what was still beating. After that he changed in the small ways a hard man changes, the ways he thinks nobody sees. He started shaving again, scraping his jaw with cold water at the gray edge of morning before either of us was rightly up. He gave her his coat the first hard night without a word, just shrugged out of it and laid it over her shoulders, and went and tended the horses like that was where he'd meant to go anyhow. He rode beside her instead of behind, which for a man hauling a bounty is the same as taking the chain off. And he talked. Lord, the man talked, who in 11 years had given me maybe 4 full paragraphs about himself. I lay in the wagon bed healing and listened to him tell her about Sarah, about the fever winter, about how he'd taken up the manhunting after because it was a thing that kept him moving and kept him from the bottle, and didn't ask him to feel one way or another about anybody. And I heard her tell him things back. Lo, the way you only tell the truth to someone who's told you theirs first. I'd have called it courting if either of them had been free to court, but there was a warrant between them and her name on it, and the long shadow of Hadley's crossing where it would all be decided, and they were both of them too honest to pretend the shadow wasn't there. So it stayed in the small things. A coat, the coffee first, the way she started saving the heel of the bread for him because she'd noticed he liked it and would never have asked. The way he started killing more game than 3 people needed, so she'd never once feel the want she'd been living in. Frontier love don't always announce itself. Sometimes it just quietly stops letting the other person go hungry or cold, and you look up one day and find a home has grown up around the two of you out on the bare ground where you weren't watching. We learned how bad Tim Pell wanted her dead at a place called the Pintata Ford. They'd been ahead of us, his riders, 4 of them, set up where the trail had to cross the river, and a person was bunched and slow in the water. We'd have ridden right into it if Della hadn't known the country. She'd cooked for cattle outfits all up and down it, and she pulled her horse up short a 1/4 mile out and said the cottonwoods at the ford were wrong, too still, no birds. Ezra trusted her by then the way you trust your own ears. We circled wide and came down on the high bank above, and there they were, dismounted and waiting in the brush with their rifles laid across logs, watching the crossing. I want to be honest about that day, because a man's tempted to make these things bigger than they were. There wasn't much shooting. Ezra Calloway's name was worth more than any 4 hired guns, and when he stood up on that high bank with the light behind him and called down that he had the Mercer woman and was taking her to the territorial court alive, and that the first man to lift a rifle would answer to a judge for murder and not to Royce Tim Pell for wages, 3 of the 4 found they had pressing business elsewhere. The 4th was a hard case named Sutter who didn't scare, and he made his try, and Ezra was faster, and Sutter caught a ball through the shoulder for it and dropped his rifle in the river and sat down in the mud cursing while his arm bled. We didn't kill him. Ezra never killed where he didn't have to. That was part of the code too. We took his guns and his boots and left him his horse, which is a frontier mercy that humbles a man worse than dying, and we made the ford. But riding out, Della was white around the mouth and not from the danger. He sent them to take me before any court, she said. You heard him, before the court. He doesn't want me tried, Mr. Calloway. A trial keeps a record. He wants me gone. She looked at the 2 of us. And you with me now, you've crossed him. He'll say you were in it with me. He'll have a story for the both of you by the time we reach Hadley's, and it'll be a clean one, because he buys clean ones. Ezra rode quiet a while. Then he said the thing that settled it, the thing I'd been waiting 2 weeks to hear him say. I was hired to bring in a thief, he said. I find I've been carrying an honest woman the long way to a court so a rich man can have her killed quiet on the road. That warrant's no good. A warrant sworn out to murder somebody isn't a warrant, it's a hired knife with a county seal on it. He reached into his coat and he took out Tim Pell's paper, the one he'd read twice in the land office a lifetime ago, and he tore it once down the middle and once across, and he let the wind take the pieces out over the Pintata. I don't ride for that, he said. Never have. She watched the paper go. Then you've thrown away $2,000, she said, and made an enemy of the richest man in the country, for a woman you met 3 weeks ago over a rifle barrel. Looks that way, Ezra said. Why? He didn't answer her in words. He looked at her the way I'd caught him looking at her sleeping by the fire, and this time he didn't hide it, and her face did a thing that it hadn't done the whole trail. It came undone, just for a breath, the careful holding of it giving way to something younger and more frightened and more hopeful than she'd let either of us see. Then she got it back, because she was who she was, and she faced front and rode, and we none of us said anything more for a good 10 miles. But it was said. Out there above the pintata with a torn warrant blowing down river, it was said as plain as if he'd shouted it. Now I told you Ezra never missed a man he set out after, and I told you he never brought in the wrong one. The truth is bigger than that, and I'll give it to you whole. The one time the paper was wrong, he was the only man in the territory honest enough to throw the paper away. Any other hunter would have delivered her, taken the money, slept fine. The law said the law. Ezra said the truth, and there's a hard difference, and he'd buried enough of his own life to know it. We came into Hadley's Crossing on a market Saturday with the streets full, which was Della's doing. She wanted witnesses. She wanted it loud. She wanted no quiet road for Tempel to work on. We went straight to the territorial marshal, a square gray man named Bram Oakes who'd known Ezra 20 years and trusted him further than he trusted most paper. And here's where Della Mercer showed the whole of what she was, because this was never our rescue. It was hers. We'd carried her the last hard miles, but the case she laid down on Bram Oakes' desk was hers, built over 11 months in a blind old man's house, copied in a cook's careful hand by candlelight. She didn't have the pages on her. She'd not been fool enough to carry the one thing that could save or hang her into a country full of Tempel's men. She'd left them, she told us now, with a circuit preacher she trusted back in the Burnt Fork country, a man who carried the territory's mail along his rounds and had no love for Tempel, sealed in an envelope addressed to the territorial court with instructions to deliver it if she didn't come for it herself by the spring. A dead woman's word can still reach, she'd told Ezra at Dove Tank, and now I understood it. She'd posted her own resurrection before she ever ran. The preacher had ridden in 2 days ahead of us, having heard the country was full of Tempel riders and fearing for the lady who trusted him. The envelope was already in Bram Oakes' safe, and inside it, in Della Mercer's hand, were the true pages, the road brands, the dates, the neighbors' marks burned over, the 2 columns that didn't match, 2 years of a rich man's theft set down clean enough for any judge to read. Alongside it, she'd written out the names of the small ranchers Tempel had ruined, the men whose strays had gone east under his iron, men who'd lost their places and never known why the market always seemed to run against them in particular. A dozen of them lived within a day of Hadley's. Marshal Oakes read it the way Ezra read warrants, slow, his thumb moving down it. When he was done, he sat back and took his hat off and ran his hand over his gray head and said a word I won't repeat, and then he said, "Royce Tempel," like the name tasted bad, and I knew Della Mercer was going to live. Tempel came, of course. He'd had a rider on us since the pintata, and he came into Hadley's the next morning with a lawyer and a clean story and Lyle at his side, and he stood up in the territorial courtroom and swore that the Mercer woman had stolen his strongbox and seduced 2 known bounty men into helping her flee, and he said it all in the smooth, owning way he'd said everything in the land office, like the words were money and he had plenty. For about 10 minutes it was even working. He was a big man and a rich one, and the territory was used to letting his kind write the ending. Then the judge had the pages read out, and then he had the small ranchers brought in, the ones the marshal had sent for, a dozen weathered men who'd come at a gallop when they heard, and one by one they stood up and matched their lost cattle to the dates and the brands in Tempel's own book, and you could watch the smooth go out of Royce Tempel like water out of a cracked jug. The strongbox theft fell apart in an hour. No box was ever produced, no proof but his word, and his word was bleeding out of him in front of the whole town. By afternoon, it wasn't Della Mercer the marshal was holding. It was Tempel and his son, on a stack of charges as tall as a man, sworn out on the evidence of a cook who could cipher. The judge looked at Della a long time before he spoke to her. "Miss Mercer," he said, "you've been carried into my court as a thief. You leave it as the only honest bookkeeper that ranch ever had. The warrant against you is void, and I'll see it struck from every paper in this territory. You're free to go anywhere under the sky, and you go cleared." He looked over at Ezra and me, standing along the wall, and something almost like a smile worked at him. "And you two are either the worst bounty men in the West or the best, and I've not decided which. You brought me a thief and handed me a cattle baron. Get out of my courtroom before I make you deputies." Outside on the steps, with the market noise all around us and the spring sun finally warm, Della Mercer stood blinking in the light of being free. And I'll tell you, she looked younger by 10 years and more lost than I'd ever seen her. Because a person who's been carrying a load that long doesn't always know how to stand when it's lifted. Ezra stood off away, holding her rifle. He'd carried it in his scabbard since Dove Tank, mine, he'd said, and now he came across the steps and held it out to her. "But first, the last fence down." "That's yours," he said. "Always was, I just held it a while." She took it, and then she didn't move, and neither did he, and the whole loud street seemed to go quiet around the two of them the way it does when something's about to be decided. "I'm free to go anywhere under the sky," she said. "The judge said so." "He did," said Ezra. "And you've no warrant on me, and no claim, and no reason in this world I owe you a thing. You threw the bounty in the river. You can't even say I cost you nothing, because I cost you $2,000 and the friendship of the richest man in the country." "All true," Ezra said. She looked up at him, and that frightened, hopeful young thing came back into her face and stayed this time. "Then I want it said plain," she said, "because I've had enough of men who say things sideways and mean another thing under. Say it plain, Mr. Calloway, and I'll answer plain, and we'll neither of us spend the rest of our lives wondering." And Ezra Calloway, who'd given me 4 paragraphs in 11 years, took off his hat and stood there bareheaded on the courthouse steps in front of God and the whole market, and said it as plain as a man ever said anything. "I buried my heart with my wife 8 years ago," he said, "and I'd have told you it was gone for good, and I'd have meant it. Then a fool got himself snake-bit, and a woman wanted on a lie sat up 2 nights to keep him breathing, and I watched her do it. And I felt the thing I thought was dead start up again behind my ribs like it had only been waiting on the right reason. I don't want to ride away from you, Della. I've spent 8 years riding away from everything. I'm done with it. I'd build you a house and a home and grow old at your fire if you'd have a hard old manhunter who's got nothing to offer but the truth and a steady hand. That's plain. That's all of it. Now you said you'd answer plain." She was crying, but she was a woman who could cry and still hold her chin up, which is its own kind of strength and one I've come to honor. "I answer plain," she said. "I've been owned by nobody and beholden to nobody since the day I put a skillet across Lyle Tempel's face, and I mean to stay that way. So understand me, I don't come to your fire because I need a roof or a name or a man's gun between me and the world. I've kept myself fine without all 3. She reached out and took his rough hand in both of hers, the same hands that had kept my blood inside me. "I come because I want to. Because somewhere on that trail you stopped being the man with the warrant and started being the man I'd choose over any free sky the judge could offer. That's my answer. I choose you, Ezra. Of my own free will, as my own free self, I choose you." And she did, and he her. And they were married at Hadley's Crossing inside the month by the same circuit preacher who'd kept her resurrection sealed in his saddlebag, with a courthouse full of small ranchers in their clean shirts for witnesses, and me standing up beside Ezra holding the ring in a hand that still couldn't quite close all the way from the snakebite. They took a piece of the burnt fork country, as it happened good grass that had belonged to one of the men Tempel ruined, sold back cheap to a partnership of his neighbors once the cattle baron was broken up and parceled out, and Ezra and Della bought their share honest. He hung up the manhunting, said he'd brought in his last bounty and it had turned out to be his wife, and he figured a man ought to quit while he was that far ahead. He learned cattle from the men around him and was bad at it for a year and good at it after, and she kept the books, of course, true ones, 1 column, the way books ought to be kept. In time there were children taken in, the first 2, A brother and sister orphaned off a wagon train that fevered out near the salt lick, and Della Mercer that was looked at those two scared mites and said come with me the same way Ezra had said it to her over a rifle barrel. And that was that. They were hers. A blood child came after, a girl, and the three of them grew up on that grass, not knowing their mother had once been the most wanted woman in the territory. Only that she could doctor any hurt and cipher any sum and outshoot their father, which she could. I stayed on. Where else would I go? A man who's been bit by the right snake at the right time has no business pretending he found his way to that fire by accident. I'm an old man now, older than Ezra got to be. He went a few winters back, easy, in his own bed with her hand on his wrist counting the blood in him the way she'd once counted mine, which struck me as a thing the Lord arranged on purpose. Della's still out there on the burnt fork, gray now and straight as ever, and the grandchildren think I'm half a fairy tale. But I knew Ezra Calloway 11 years before that spring and 30 after, and I'll tell you the truest thing I know about the man, and it's this. He never missed a man he set out after, and the one time the warrant was wrong, he was the only soul honest enough to tear it up, throw away the money, and carry the truth the hard way home. And the truth, it turned out, was a thin, proud woman with a rifle who'd been running toward justice the whole time the rest of us thought she was running from it. He thought he was hauling in a thief. He came home with a wife, a family, and the only honest book the burnt fork ever kept. A man could do worse with his life than that. Most of us do. Ezra didn't in the end, and the reason was a woman the whole territory called the coldest thief in it. And she turned out to be the warmest, truest thing that ever cracked a hard man's heart back open and made him glad to be alive inside it.